make it clear.
Order. I did not make the comment.
Well, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Over the last 3 weeks, Citizen A has been focused like a laser beam on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Conference taking place in Auckland. Joining me tonight to conclude the ramifications of free trade with our new American corporate overlords, she is one of New Zealand's best-known academics and critics of free trade, Professor of Law, Policy and International Economic Regulation, Professor Jane Kelsey, and he is the editor of independent news site livenews.co.nz, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, what was most disappointing about the protest on Saturday? The way the mainstream media covered it or the abuse of police actions? Issue 2, which political parties are aiding the TPP and which ones are fighting it? And issue 3, what is the future of the Trans-Pacific Partnership now it leaves town? Plus we'll end the show on a final word. But let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. Perhaps it's testament to how underfunded the news media are these days, but TV cameras only turned up at the TPP protest on Saturday after police had attacked protesters. The late coverage enabled the police to claim it was the protesters who were violent, minus any scrutiny of their instigation of that violence. Jane, explain to me why you weren't allowed to hand over the hundreds of thousands of signatures against the TPP at the conference on Saturday. What happened there?
Well, I think there's a bit of confusion about what happened. The rally, which was great down in Aotea Square, and the march up to the convention centre was lots of oldies of our age. Younger people with pushchairs. Quite a lot of Māori, a big range of people, and it was great. Lots of energy, colour, noise. We got to the convention centre and the plan was that I would hand over the Avars petition of around 750,000 signatures. In fact, not the petition itself, but a letter from Avars. And then we had a whole lot of boxes that we constructed a wall that on it had "The world says no to TPPA." Yep. When we got there, I was told that we couldn't have the international delegation hand over the petition. To hand it over, there could be me and one other person and a photographer. And we couldn't read out the letter in front of the delegation. We had to read it out beforehand before anyone would come out. And so, okay, we played that game and I read it out on the megaphone, which the sound system was on the other side of the road, which was a bit unfortunate. And then Laurie Wallach from Public Citizen in the US and myself went to hand over the letter, and we didn't get the chief negotiator, we got his deputy who took it and then scuttled back in, especially after I'd said we expect a reply by Friday. And I then went back and explained on the megaphone to people, but I think that's where some of the confusion came in because I think people thought that they had refused altogether to accept the petition, whereas what they'd done was try to close it down to make as minimal a photo op as possible. But as you said, the TV wasn't there anyway, so the photo op was limited. And so I think what happened, because there was a lot of noise, a lot of chanting, quite a lot of people didn't actually hear the full information. But in any case, it was an unacceptable way for the delegation to behave.
Selwyn, you were one of the first media organisations to pick up the story of the recorded conversation of a senior New Zealand police officer boasting about how happy the US Embassy was with their actions. Will the mainstream media, in your opinion, pay as much attention to that as they did over the supposed protest of violence? Are we going to see it leading the 6 p.m. news tonight?
Well, it's up to them to kind of make their calls. What has been the case here for the last 2 weeks is some pretty lacklustre kind of reporting over the whole issue. When there are issues that develop, when there are charged emotions and responsive kind of tactics, if you like, being used by both police and the protest movement, there needs to be robust coverage, and there needs to be the media, mainstream media, right in amongst that. They needed to, prior to this, develop contacts amongst not just police, who, you know, they've obviously got the PR people in police well sorted, but within the activist community, so that when things get sharp, that they can get in there and get the sides and start to listen and then develop the analysis to get a rationale from it. I think the problem is here is that the mainstream, in particular the New Zealand Herald, the Herald on Sunday on the weekend, and Television New Zealand, completely misrepresenting the realities. What we had in that audio tape was a police officer of seniority talking robustly in the first instance, unfortunately just off tape, about how they had clipped John Minto in the eye.
And they were boasting about it, weren't they?
Boasting about that kind of
thumping John Minto.
violence.
Yeah.
Then we saw, and what was recorded, this discussion which indicated how close they were to reporting what they had done to the United States Embassy, but also the gratification they got that it was favourably received by the US Embassy, which raises very serious questions about who is the master and who is the minder here.
Yeah, are the New Zealand police there for New Zealand's interests, or are they there for America's
Well,
interests?
these are the obvious questions that we would like the mainstream media to have the guts to ask.
Will we get those questions asked? Do you think,
Certainly
this week?
not tonight. And
Certainly not tonight.
It would probably take action where their own journalists are thumped by the cops before they wake up.
So it would have to be their journalists.
And also for them to think that their natural audience isn't just going to sit there and think, well, they're grubby protesters. What do they expect?
Exactly. They probably deserved
they're
it.
New Zealand citizens that are expressing their right.
Jane, this entire conference has been a tournament of lies wrapped up in mistruths and empty promises, and they've got all the validity of a corporate sales pitch. How do you counter that avalanche of crap?
Well, you know, I think Saturday was an interesting sign of just how angry people were, you know, and the lockout that there'd been, the attitude from the Prime Minister saying, ignore these people, the language from Tim Grosser about projectile vomiting, the Prime Minister plucking figures out of the air and so on, misrepresenting the constitutional arrangements. I mean, I think I said last week that this was a sign of sort of how desperate they were. And in a sense, whilst I'm really pissed off about what happened on Saturday with the media, and we had been there, I've been in contact with the main three television to be there, and they didn't come until they thought that they had something sensational they could use.
Stimulated by the police.
Before that, I'd actually been quite pleased with the media coverage. One of the things that we'd set out right from when the book was published around this in November 2010 to set a mainstream debate where this wouldn't just be dismissed as, oh, here's the anti-globalisation activists again. And quite a lot of journalists, including many in the press gallery, now get it. And so when the business community tried to present their cheerleading letter, I understand there was a lot of scepticism from the journalists there. There was TV3's coverage, actually, I thought was quite good in a lot of the news kind of coverage and the morning coverage and so on. TVNZ was hopeless. Yes. There were some economic commentators who were doing really good stuff, like Rod Oram and Brian Fallow and so on. Even Audrey Young was doing a mixture of pieces, not just cheerleading pieces. And even Fran O'Sullivan, bless her, did her numbers. So, what we set out to do was to set the agenda and to have them responding to the critique. And that was what happened. And I think that shows the strength of the arguments on our side and the weakness of the arguments on theirs.
Selwyn, were the police on Saturday attempting to instigate a situation by bashing protesters to provoke the response and resulting headlines of violence by protesters? Do you think that was a specific tactic on Saturday?
Well, that's what I would like to, why I would like to see some light put on this issue, so that we can get to a position where we can, figure out whether or not it was a premeditated tactic. Their strategy was obviously to do something. What was that strategy? Why did they use and deploy these types of inflammatory tactics to achieve it? So you're left with I think a reasonable response is to think, well, the protest was relatively peaceful, there was street theatre, there were all these things going on. The police turn up in bigger numbers and then the thing explodes into violence. Why? because one of the cops was sent in on his own,
that's right.
basically, with a couple in tow, but with a crash helmet on.
Yes.
So he, grabs and pushes while the supposed person who was in charge of this whole thing, this more senior cop, is elbowing people in the jaw, pushing people over, joined down at the Sky City Casino by security guards pushing people over. Maybe viewers, a small percentage out there tonight that are thinking, but the protesters should expect this. Well, I'm sorry, no. You shouldn't expect that if you're there and you're doing street theatre, the next thing you know, there's a young 20-something young woman that's getting manhandled by cops, dragged around, pushed to the ground, that somebody, somewhere, reasonably should step in and try to re-establish order.
Right.
The police weren't doing it from all reasonable angles. It looked like they were the instigators.
That's right.
That's why it needs light, Bomber.
Final question to both of you on this. What was most disappointing about the protests on Saturday? The way the mainstream media covered it, or the abuse of police actions? What were you most let down by?
Well, I'd actually left by the time things happened, and so I've, like others, been watching the videos. And I think the thing that worries me, back in the days when we used to have vigorous protests, the media was an important part of the whole world is watching. If they are going to be trying to push this deal by October next year, there is going to be more action out on the streets. And it worries me that we've now got the media taking this upbeat role and the cops taking this partisan role of not simply protecting the forces of power, but also having to defend their own kind of kind of responses by starting at a point where the ante is already upped. And we've seen that a number of times in this country before, whether it's the Waitangi protests or the tour or whatever. And my feeling is that there is a real groundswell, not just in Auckland but in other places, of anger about this agreement. And if we are going to have mobilisations, we need to be very clear what the rules of both the police and the media are going to be here.
Selwyn, your thoughts?
Well, what we wanted there was a really good examination of the different ideas around the TPPA. What happened was television cameras go for where the action is. So the public was denied the ability, the privilege of being able to sit there in their homes and think through the issues. What we saw was biased coverage coming through that was basically just saying, well, anyone against this kind of thing is deserves to be dealt with by the cops, and I think the public would just faced with a disservice.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, which political parties are aiding the TPP and which ones are fighting it? Selwyn, aren't Labour horribly compromised over free trade because they are still wedded to free market dogma, aren't they?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's all ideological positions which the various parties take. And we all know, that the Labour Party throughout the 2000s was trying to find a position where it had something to barter when it was negotiating around a free trade table. South Korea is a perfect case in point there. New Zealand had already liberalised to the point where it had nothing really to offer if it wanted access to the agricultural markets in South Korea. South Korea would say, well, we can drop our tariffs and things like that, but what are you going to give? The most fascinating thing, and I think this is where Labour is also rocked on this, is that the TPPA negotiations have brought to the surface what New Zealand does have to offer, what it does have to debate with, what it can and seems willing to get out of the road. And that is a very big concern. And those are the areas around biosecurity, those barriers, for example, that prevent dodgy exporters overseas putting their bad meat and bad produce into the shops and markets of New Zealand. Those biosecurity barriers, our government at the moment, the national-led government, has indicated it is prepared to reduce those barriers. So the rationale and logic is that we are prepared to reduce those types of safety and sanitary barriers at the expense of the safety and sanitary kind of conditions we would expect this to get a deal. that is an interesting aspect of what's come out in my view.
Jane, the Greens and Mana have been the loudest opponents to this deal in the political parties.
And New Zealand First.
And New Zealand First. Who's helping, who isn't?
I think that there is a solid bloc who are opposed to both the process and the content.
Right.
And so there you've got the Greens, New Zealand First and Mana. If you look at Labour, it was really significant that policy remit that was passed at their conference a couple of weeks ago. Yeah? And it was passed overwhelmingly. It set a whole lot of preconditions around Labour supporting a deal, and those are preconditions that will not be met because they include things like disclosing the text during the process, stuff around meds, stuff around investor state.
So the rank and file are very against this.
Very strong. Phil Goff moved an amendment, which was a sort of a linguistic amendment, didn't actually affect things very much. But what interested me was that at a symposium that we had Friday before last, the two people there from Labour were Phil Goff and Clayton Cosgrove. Right? Phil Goff, evangelist for free trade agreements. Clayton Cosgrove, protege of Mike Moore. They are the two who hold those spokespeople's positions that are most pivotal. Yet we know also that there have been robust discussions in the caucus, and we know that those guys are actually in the minority in the caucus. There are some really serious kinds of questions, not only for the issues that Sel raised, but if you take the pharmaceuticals, there was a protest on Saturday of 250 people at Nelson. Marion Street spoke there. And she said, or was reported to have said, you can be a supporter of free trade agreements and oppose the TPPA. And so I think those who have sectoral concerns are going to be in there. The real dilemma for Labour is that our calculations are that the Cabinet is going to have to make a decision in either May or June on what trade-offs there's going to be. So there's a quite small window there for the Labour caucus to have this discussion, especially if in the year after this is when it has to get processed through the parliamentary structures in its cosmetic fashion, but through there. And if any legislation has to be passed, such as in the intellectual property law,
the food bill,
then it will be right in the electoral cycle. And that's what makes the politics interesting.
These are the necessary precursor legislative agendas that need to be put into place prior to the TPPA being met at the end of the day.
Selwyn, can we honestly trust Grosser to act in New Zealand's interests when he's applying to the WTO for their top job? Can we honestly believe he's going to be a good dealer for us?
Yeah, I read your argument on that, and I think this is one of the problems when we've got such a small pool of so-called talent in this country that is leading the charge, that inevitably they're going to have their self-interest kind of get involved when they're looking at what are they going to do once they lose office. Grosser, of course, came from MFAT, Foreign Affairs Wing. He always talked in a sense of in an administrative role as opposed to a governance role in many respects by nature. And so, I think the biggest thing with Grosser is the focus should be on his negotiating skills. For someone who's been around the trade negotiation areas for so long, it seems absolutely beyond belief that he would indicate New Zealand's fallback positions even before these negotiations came in. And I'm kind of thinking, mate, are you past your use-by date or what?
Final question to both of you on this. Will TPP be a political issue come 2014? You're saying that because of the mechanics of how they're going to pass it through, it's going to be an election issue for us?
I think once Labour understands that many of their policies would not be deliverable, they are going to be in really serious strife if they don't start to take a strong position on it. But the real dilemma for us is that they are talking about this political summit in early October, where Obama will schmooze all of the other leaders and they will make these backroom trade-offs.
At the side room to the APEC.
Around about the time of the APEC meeting, because that's when they're all in the same place. And then we are going to have a dogfight here to say you may have indicated that this is what the country is going to do, and you may have signed a piece of paper to say that, but not in our name. And so that's where I think it becomes crucial, especially if Labor, in a coalition, was going to have to rely on New Zealand First, the Greens and Mana.
This is exactly my point there, that Labor is forced into a situation where it has to already embrace that red-green bloc to even hope of becoming government. So therefore it has to think through that filter, through that Green Party lens. Also, there are areas inside Labor which Jane has eloquently identified there that are not wanting to open up our whole country, for example, to having no way of monitoring or filtering or reducing the demands from overseas corporate entities relating to mining, pharmaceuticals, etc., etc. Those are things that are pretty core to Labor. You know, if we're thinking, particularly the latest version of Labor in majority in caucus, I'm talking about as opposed to leadership, it does seem that they are more interventionist. What this whole dogma is insisting on is less government, get out of the road, and if you do, you're going to be sued in the courts.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. So now the dust has settled. What are we to make of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Out of the 29 chapters of the TPP, only 5 deal with trade as we would traditionally understand it. The remaining chapters are all about deregulating the way New Zealand domestically runs its economy. Jane, help me out here. This week, John Key is visiting the families of the Pike River mining tragedy to apologise for the despicable lack of regulation that led to their deaths. Yet he's also pushing to sign this TPP, which would deregulate the entire economy. How long can this political schizophrenia continue without being challenged?
First thing we have to do is to continue to break through that barrier that this is not about trade. And I think some of the polling that we've had coming through in the last week is showing that people are getting it. You know, people not only are voting 4-1 in the polls about the secrecy issues, but about the right of investors to sue. There's a new poll that will be coming out in relation to health that shows similar kinds of results. And so I think people are now starting to understand. What worries me is that the time is so short. And once you've had the focal point of this meeting disappear, you don't have a catalyst around which you can generate that discussion. So I think there's going to have to be some quite sharp thinking about what kinds of focal points we can use, including, I think, not only the mining areas, but and the there's a whole lot of political issues that are currently on the table that the Nats are going to have to deal with. The charter schools issues and some of those issues are hugely unpopular. People don't quite understand what the relationships are there. There's a number of health and safety and labour law issues that are coming up. And so I think we've got to find a way to get people who have a sectoral focus to understand that what they want as changes are going to become impossible if the juggernaut is able to ride through.
So when America wants this free trade deal to boost their corporate's hegemony as a bulwark against Chinese expansion to the Pacific, which means they will be ruthless in its application because it's been elevated to a national security threshold. Are we screwed?
We are, as we've said in the past, the spam that is stuck between 2 big slices of bread. It is a fact at the moment the Chinese, via its embassy, are very, very sensitive to what is going on here. That they are asking around different people and different groups and different entities in New Zealand what it is about the TPP that, one, is attractive to New Zealand
because they see it's counter to our economic
and secondly, what aspects of the American-led TPP are New Zealanders concerned about? Those are the 2 simple questions. That indicates a great angst inside China. Of course, it has sent up its counter that Jane has spoken on your program about, relating to its own version. And it is trying to see what aspects were unpalatable with the United States one to what would be a goer should China roll it out here. New Zealand's in a terrible situation. Beyond that, and I say that seriously, I really do believe we're in a terrible situation here. It cannot be sustained. But beyond that, what has New Zealand got to gain by being this pendulum that is being whacked by the United States, chipping China in the jaw and then massaged back the other way by China. Very little if you take from the point of view of access, agricultural access to the United States market. Every indication coming out of fairly esteemed publications in the United States is saying, and Laurie Walk said on your program, Wallach said it on your program, there's no way the United States is going to open up its borders to upset its own agricultural things.
That's right.
So New Zealand has very little to gain from what is a very, very tumultuous period relating to geopolitics.
Yeah. Jane, let's wrap the show with a final word, your reflection over the last 3 weeks, please.
The thing that worries me most is the lack of accountability of those who are acting in our name. And it came through again at the so-called stakeholder briefing. It was a pageant of an hour and a half of not answering any questions, including about China. If we can't find a way to break through that wall of silence, we are going to be locked into a legal tragedy that is going to be really hard to undo. And so I know people have got a whole pile of priorities and pressures and urgent things they have to deal with, and this seems so far out there, but we have to pull out all the stops to make sure that the Cabinet cannot pull it off, because if you go to the Cabinet manual, it says treaty making is done by the executive, and we need to make sure that they cannot do this to us.
Selwyn, your final words.
Well, I think once again that this is not necessarily an ideological argument. It is one, can be even termed as a pragmatic one. If the results and consequences of this TPPA are counter to not just the country's interests, but every individual's interests, then we deserve to be able to have the information to gain a rational view and opinion on it all. And I think that's why the secrecy is around that, because there are people inside that are frightened that if the public actually sees what the true consequence would be, then it is going to actually face a mountain of mobilisation that it has never had before. I'd suggest very quickly that people need to watch every step of the legislative agenda, that the national government is ready and primed to get the MPs back early next year to get things rolling. And to really look at it. And if you don't like it, don't sit down and leave it for other people to say why. Get out there and have a go yourself.
Amen. Thank you, Selwyn. Thank you, Jane. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. When I decided to do a 3-part series on the Trans-Pacific Partnership for Citizen A, it was because this is the largest threat to our political and economic sovereignty our generation has ever faced. America is using the suffocation of our ability to pass domestic laws so that their corporations have a constant edge over China and the Pacific. Key's claims of us making $3 billion from this democratic noose are as vacant as his aspiration. If we sign this, our medicines will increase in cost. Our ability to pass laws for New Zealand's interests are eroded, and American corporations will be able to prosecute any government who threaten their profit dominance. The latest Roy Morgan poll staggeringly has National at 45.5%. Sleepy hobbits will reap what they sow. And if this free trade deal is passed, my bet is that they will be the first to scream, "What's happening?" By then, it will be far too late to stop these corporations, and Key's gentle promise of making billions will be tomorrow's fish and chip wrappings. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Join us next week for the Citizen A wrap-up of the 2012 news year. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.